The mountains of the American West held secrets older than memory, carved into stone by wind and time, where the echoes of ancient spirits danced with the whispers of modern dreams. In these unforgiving peaks, where winter could kill a man in hours and summer could drive him mad with thirst, there lived a soul so weathered by solitude that he had become part of the landscape itself. Ezekiel "Zeke" Morrison had been prospecting these treacherous heights for 17 long years, his calloused hands telling stories of countless dawns spent breaking rock and sifting through gravel, searching for that elusive glint of gold that would justify his self-imposed exile from civilization. His camp, perched precariously on a narrow ledge that overlooked a valley so deep that eagles nested below his crude shelter, consisted of little more than a canvas lean-to, reinforced with weathered planks and stones. The isolation was complete, absolute, and had long since stopped bothering him. Or so he convinced himself during those endless conversations he held with his own reflection in the crystal-clear mountain streams that carved their way through the granite like liquid silver. Hey there, friend. Before we dive deeper into old Zeke's incredible story, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I always love hearing from folks all around the world who share a passion for these frontier stories. Zeke's daily routine had become as predictable and unchanging as the sunrise that painted the mountain peaks gold each morning. He would wake before the first light touched the eastern ridges, his body responding to an internal clock that had been wound by years of solitary discipline. The fire in his stone-ringed pit never truly died. He had learned early in his mountain exile that letting a fire go cold could mean the difference between life and death when the temperature dropped without warning. He would stoke the glowing embers back to life, brew coffee strong enough to strip paint from a barn door, and prepare for another day of back-breaking labor that had yet to yield so much as a flake of the precious metal he sought. His tools had become extensions of his weathered body, the pickaxe that had belonged to his father, who had died chasing gold in California's Sierra Nevada, bore the scars of 10,000 strikes against unforgiving granite. The handle, worn smooth by his grip, fit his hands like it had been carved specifically for his palms. His gold pan, dented and scratched by countless hours in icy mountain streams, had developed a patina that spoke of dedication bordering on obsession. The work was soul-crushing, physically devastating, and utterly futile. But it was his work, his purpose, and in a world that had forgotten his existence, that meant everything. The mountains themselves seemed to mock his efforts with cruel indifference. Every promising vein of quartz that caught his eye led to nothing but more barren rock. Every glimmer in his pan that made his heart race turned out to be fool's gold or mica, catching the light just long enough to raise his hopes before dashing them against the harsh reality of another empty day. But Zeke persisted with the stubborn determination of a man who had burned all bridges behind him, driven by something deeper than greed or even rational hope. Perhaps it was the simple fact that he had nowhere else to go, no other life to return to in the world below, that had moved on without him. The changing seasons marked time in his mountain fortress with the reliability of a cosmic clock. Spring brought the dangerous beauty of snowmelt that could turn a gentle creek into a raging torrent in minutes. Summer scorched the high country with a sun that seemed close enough to touch, while autumn painted the aspens in shades of gold that mocked the treasure he sought. But it was winter that truly tested a man's resolve. Months of isolation so complete that the sound of his own voice became foreign to his ears. Trapped in a world of white silence where a single mistake could mean death. Zeke had survived 16 such winters already, each one taking a little more out of him, wearing him down like water on stone. His hair had turned the color of fresh snow. His back had developed a permanent stoop from years of bending over his work, and his hands had become so gnarled that they resembled the twisted roots of ancient trees. But his eyes still held the fire of determination, the spark that had driven him into these mountains in the first place, fleeing from a past that haunted him more than any ghost. The truth was that Zeke Morrison was running from more than just the disappointments of civilized life. He carried with him the weight of decisions made in haste, words spoken in anger, and opportunities lost to pride and stubbornness. The mountains had become his penance, his monastery, where he could atone for his failures through the simple act of enduring. Each day of fruitless labor was a prayer, each night of solitude a meditation on the choices that had led him to this place of exile. As autumn tightened its grip on the high country like a closing fist, Zeke could feel the approach of another winter in his aching bones. The aspens had already turned their brilliant gold, a sight that would have taken his breath away if he had allowed himself to appreciate beauty for its own sake. But Zeke's eyes were always fixed on the ground, searching for signs of color that never came, hope that never materialized. The nights were growing longer and colder, and soon the snows would come to trap him in his mountain fortress for months of isolation that would test the very limits of human endurance. It was on one such evening, as the last light of day painted the western peaks in shades of orange and purple, that Zeke's carefully ordered world was turned upside down by an encounter that would challenge everything he thought he knew about solitude, survival, and the nature of human connection. He had returned from another fruitless day at his claim, his back screaming in protest, his hands raw and bleeding from handling rough stone, his spirit as battered as his body by the endless cycle of hope and disappointment that defined his existence. His evening ritual was as unchanging as the mountains themselves, a series of actions performed with the precision of a religious ceremony. First, he would tend to his fire, adding logs he had split and stacked during the brief summer months when such work was possible. The fire was more than warmth. It was life itself in this harsh wilderness, the difference between seeing another dawn and becoming just another skeleton bleaching in the mountain sun. Then he would heat water for coffee and whatever meager meal he could cobble together from his dwindling supplies, mostly beans and hardtack, with the occasional rabbit or squirrel, when his ancient rifle cooperated and his aim proved true. But this night was different in ways that his mountain-sharpened senses detected immediately. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with approaching weather. Even the ever-present wind that whistled through the peaks had fallen silent, as if the mountains themselves were waiting for something momentous to occur. His fire, which he had banked carefully that morning before heading to his claim, was burning brighter than it should have been, flames dancing higher than the careful conservative blaze he always maintained to preserve his precious fuel. Someone had been feeding it. Someone had been here, in his sanctuary, touching his things, violating the sacred solitude that had been his only companion for so many years. Zeke's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip, a weapon that had saved his life more times than he cared to remember in the lawless early days of his mountain exile. His eyes scanned the shadows around his camp with the practiced wariness of a man who had learned that survival depended on constant vigilance, searching for movement, for any sign of the intruders who had dared to invade his private world. But what he saw when he rounded the last boulder that concealed his camp from the trail below defied every expectation, every fear, every possibility his mind could conjure. 8 figures sat in perfect silence around his fire, as still as the stones themselves, as if they had been there since the beginning of time and would remain long after the mountains crumbled to dust. 8 Apache warriors, their faces painted with the shadows and light of the flames, their eyes reflecting the dancing fire like pools of dark water that held depths he could not fathom. They hadn't spoken when he approached. They hadn't moved so much as a muscle. They simply sat in a perfect circle around his fire, their weapons lying beside them within easy reach but untouched, their horses barely visible in the gathering darkness, standing patient and still as their masters. There was something profoundly unsettling about their stillness, something that spoke of purpose beyond the usual patterns of frontier violence or territorial dispute. Zeke's finger tightened on his gun, but something stayed his hand. Perhaps the recognition that if these warriors had meant him harm, he would already be dead. They could have killed him easily while he was away at his claim, could have taken everything he owned and left his bones for the coyotes and vultures. Instead, they had chosen to sit by his fire and wait, as if they had some business with him that required his living presence. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, heavy with unspoken meaning and pregnant with possibilities that Zeke's isolated mind struggled to comprehend. He had heard stories of Apache warriors, tales that would freeze the blood of lesser men and send seasoned soldiers running for the safety of their forts. They were ghosts of the desert and mountains, appearing and disappearing like smoke on the wind, leaving only death and destruction in their wake. But these eight seemed different, touched by something beyond the usual patterns of frontier warfare, marked by a purpose that transcended the simple violence that had defined the relationship between their peoples. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this strange tableau that challenged everything Zeke thought he knew about the world and his place in it. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky like prayers ascending to whatever gods watched over this wild country. And still, no one spoke. Zeke found himself studying their faces in the flickering light, seeing not the savage enemies of frontier legend but men, weathered, scarred and tired men who carried the weight of their own stories in the lines around their eyes and the set of their shoulders. The eldest of the group, his hair silver in the firelight and his face marked by decades of sun and wind and conflict, finally moved, not to speak or to reach for a weapon, but simply to add another log to the fire, with a gesture so natural, so domestic, that it shattered Zeke's preconceptions like glass striking stone. This was not a war party or a raiding band come to steal his meager possessions or claim his worthless mining site. This was something else entirely, something for which his 17 years of mountain solitude had not prepared him. As the night deepened and the fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the circle of faces that surrounded it, Zeke began to understand that this encounter was not about gold or territory or the endless conflicts that had defined the relationship between white settlers and native peoples since the first Europeans had set foot on this continent. This was about something more fundamental, more essentially human, the recognition that in the vast loneliness of the wilderness, where a man could go months without hearing another voice or seeing another face, the simple act of sharing warmth and light could bridge any gap, heal any wound, and transform strangers into something approaching family. The realization hit Zeke like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and forcing him to confront truths about himself that he had spent years avoiding. For 17 years, he'd convinced himself that he preferred solitude, that he had chosen this life of isolation and self-imposed exile as a form of noble sacrifice, a way of atoning for past mistakes through the purifying fire of hardship and deprivation. But sitting here in the presence of these silent strangers, he understood that loneliness was not a choice, but a wound, and that even the deepest wounds could sometimes heal in the most unexpected ways. The fire burned through the night, tended by hands both white and red, fed by wood gathered from the same mountains that had witnessed countless conflicts between their peoples. And in that shared silence, something profound occurred, not a treaty or an alliance or any formal agreement, but a recognition of common humanity that transcended the artificial divisions that men created to justify their hatred and fear. They were all exiles in their own way, all refugees from a world that had no place for them, all seeking something in these mountains that could not be found in the settlements and cities below. When dawn finally broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to promise new beginnings and fresh possibilities, the 8 Apache warriors rose as silently as they had arrived. They gathered their weapons and their few possessions with the efficient movements of men accustomed to traveling light and moving fast, mounted their horses with the fluid grace of people born to the saddle, and prepared to disappear back into the wilderness, from which they had emerged like spirits made flesh. But before they left, the eldest warrior approached Zeke with steps that made no sound on the rocky ground. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something small and precious, placing it in Zeke's weathered palm with a gesture that spoke of respect and recognition. It was a piece of turquoise, polished smooth by countless hands and worn as a talisman against the loneliness of the trail, carved with symbols that told stories older than memory. Zeke watched them ride away until they were nothing more than specks against the vast canvas of the mountains, and then they were gone entirely, leaving him to wonder if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a dream, born of too many years of solitude and too much mountain whiskey. But the turquoise in his palm was real, warm from the touch of human hands, and the fire still burned with logs he had not placed there, proof that miracles could happen even in the loneliest places on Earth. The encounter changed something fundamental in Zeke's relationship with the mountains and with himself, shifting the very foundation of his existence in ways that he was only beginning to understand. The gold he had sought for so many years suddenly seemed less important than the human connection he had experienced around that fire, less valuable than the recognition that he was not alone in his exile, that others had found their way to this place of refuge and healing. He continued his prospecting, but with less desperation and more acceptance of whatever the mountains chose to give him. The work became a meditation rather than an obsession, a way of staying connected to the land that had sheltered him rather than a futile quest for wealth that would never come. And on quiet evenings, when the wind carried strange sounds through the canyons and the shadows seemed to move with purpose, he would add extra logs to his fire and wait, hoping that other lonely souls might find their way to his circle of light and warmth. The Apache warriors never returned, but their presence lingered in the mountains like an echo that refused to fade, like a song that continued long after the singer had departed. Zeke would sometimes catch glimpses of movement in the distance, shadows that might have been men or might have been tricks of light and stone. He never knew for certain, but he always kept his fire burning bright, a beacon in the wilderness for anyone who might need the comfort of shared warmth and silent companionship. Years passed like seasons, each one bringing its own challenges and small victories, and Zeke grew older and more bent, his hair turning white as the snow that crowned the peaks each winter. His hands became more gnarled, his steps more uncertain. But his fire never died. It became a landmark of sorts, a constant in a world of change, visible from miles away to anyone who knew where to look and what it represented. Travelers began to speak of the old prospector who kept a fire burning in the high country, a man who would share his warmth with anyone who approached in peace, regardless of their race or background, or the conflicts that divided the world below. Some said he was touched by madness, driven insane by too many years of solitude and failure. Others claimed he was blessed, protected by spirits that watched over lonely men in wild places. But Zeke knew the truth was simpler and more profound than either explanation. He had learned that in a world full of division and hatred, the simple act of sharing a fire could bridge any gap, heal any wound, and transform enemies into brothers, if only for one night. He had discovered that wealth could not be measured in nuggets and dust, but in moments of connection that illuminated the darkness of human existence like stars in the mountain sky. And in that knowledge he found a peace that all the gold in the world could never have purchased, The mountains kept their secrets, as mountains always do, but they had given Zeke something more valuable than any treasure buried in their depths: the understanding that no man is truly alone as long as there are others who recognize the universal language of warmth and light and shared silence. His fire became a symbol of that understanding, a testament to the possibility of human connection in even the most unlikely circumstances. As another winter approached, Zeke prepared for the season of isolation, with a heart that no longer dreaded the long, cold months ahead. He had learned to see his solitude not as exile but as guardianship, keeping watch over a sacred space where strangers could become friends and enemies could find common ground. His fire would burn through the winter storms, a reminder that even in the harshest places, the human spirit could find ways to create light in the deepest darkness. The story of the old prospector and the 8 Apache warriors became legend in the territory, passed down through generations of miners and settlers, cowboys and soldiers, each telling, adding new details and interpretations to the basic truth of what had occurred on that mountain ledge. Some versions painted it as a tale of supernatural intervention, others as a parable about the power of hospitality in harsh lands. But for those who knew the mountains and understood their ways, it was simply the story of what could happen when people chose to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. And high in the mountains, where the wind still carries stories through the canyons, and the stars shine with the same light that illuminated that fateful night, Zeke's fire continues to burn in the memories of all who heard the tale. It serves as a reminder that in a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, the simple act of extending warmth to a stranger can change everything, creating connections that transcend race and culture and time itself. The turquoise stone remained Zeke's most treasured possession, worn smooth by his fingers during the long winter nights when he would hold it and remember the faces around his fire. It became his talisman against despair, his proof that miracles could happen even in the loneliest places, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were not found in the ground, but in the unexpected kindness of strangers who chose to share their humanity rather than their hatred. In the end, Zeke never found the gold he had spent so many years seeking, but he discovered something far more valuable: the understanding that true wealth lay not in what a man could take from the earth, but in what he could give to his fellow travelers on the difficult journey of life. And in that understanding, he found a richness that no amount of precious metal could ever match, a treasure that would endure long after the mountains themselves had crumbled to dust, and the last echo of his story had faded from human memory.